Okay, hello everyone. My name is Blessing Ladejobi, and today I will be talking about some of the topics we have on the screen. So the first one is to define what a callback function is in JavaScript. So for us to understand what a callback function is, I feel that it is essential for us to understand two things. Number one is what a function is, and number two is what an argument is. Because when we are talking about a callback function, it simply means a function that is being passed into another function as an argument. Okay, so when we talk about function, what do we mean? And when we talk about arguments, what do we mean? So let's head straight over to our Visual Studio Code to demonstrate that. So as you can see on my screen, I have a function with the name of say hello, and then what the function does basically is to log hello in the console. So if I save this now and I call the function, so if I want to call the function, all I need to do is copy that and do like this. So if I save now and I refresh, then we should be able to see hello on my screen. Okay, so that is an example of a function. So when we say argument, what do we mean? It is a way by which we can pass another like we can pass a variable into the function. So let me comment this out. And uncomment this second example here. So this second example, we notice that the name is introduce yourself, and it accepts the name, like it accepts your name, and then it logs my name is, then it appends your name to it. Okay, so whatever name you pass into this function now, it automatically replaces it here. So if I want to call this function, I can call it like this, and then I pass in the name. So in my case, let's say Blessing, for instance. So if I save now and I refresh the page, you notice that it automatically logs my name is Blessing in the console. So what is happening here basically is this function accepts name as an argument, and then it appends it into the string. So that is what we mean by arguments. Now let me comment this out and uncomment this third instance. So this third instance is basically showing what a callback is, right? Okay, so I have to uncomment this as well to be able to demonstrate that. So you notice that we have two functions. So we have introduce yourself. Actually, I would uncomment this first one as well. So we have say hello, we have introduce yourself, and we have the third function, which is greet. Okay, so when we call this greet function, notice that we are passing greet args into this place. So this greet args simply means an argument that is meant for this greet. It can actually be anything. So notice that here we are passing name, which is a string, but in this case we are passing a function as an argument. So that is an example of a callback. Now we have function greet. It accepts another function, which is greet args. So let's assume this say hello now is what we want to pass into this greet function. So okay, let me remove this first to explain what I'm trying to say. So notice that I call greet and I pass say hello into it, which is this. So what will happen is it will log this in the console first, then call this function that is inside the parentheses. So if I save now and I go back to the browser to refresh, notice that we have greet function called and then hello. So greet function called, and then it calls this second function say hello, which is hello, right? So I think that basically explains what a callback is. Now moving to the second point, which is to demonstrate how to create and use a callback function. So we have three major ways by which we can use a callback. One way is using a named a named function. So what do I mean by a named function? That means we are passing the name of the function we are using. So in this case now I'm using say hello, right? And notice that we have the say hello here. So that is using a named function. We also have another method called anonymous function. So if I copy this same function now and I paste it here to replace that say hello, so I can remove this name. So you notice that I'm putting a function into this place as an argument, right? But the function doesn't have a name now. I've removed the name. So that is an example of anonymous function. It is a function without name. So if I save this now and I refresh, it will still give us the same thing. So as you can see, we still have the same thing on the screen. So that's another way, which is the second way by which we can do that. The third way by which we can pass an argument, or by which we can create a callback function, is using arrow function. So how do we use arrow function? We can remove the function keyword, and then we have an arrow like this, which is equals and greater sign. So if we combine it together, it gives us an arrow. So we can use the arrow like that. If we save now and refresh the page, we still have the same thing, right? So those are like the three major ways by which we can create callbacks. Now moving to the third one, which is demonstrate how to pass arguments to callback functions. So to be able to pass arguments to callbacks is very simple. So all we need to do is inside the callback function that we have here, we can pass whatever function that we want to pass. I mean, whatever argument we want to pass into it. So instead of using this greet now, I mean this argument, I can decide to use this. So the reason for that is because you notice as this function itself is accepting an argument. So we can use that to demonstrate example of a callback with argument. So you notice that greet is accepting introduce yourself as argument, and then this is what is representing the introduce yourself function now. So this also will now accept another argument, which in this case can be Kelvin, right? So if I save now and I refresh the page, notice what happened. We have greet function called, and then we have my name is Kelvin. So what is happening there? So we first run this part, which is greet function called. Then the second one is calling the callback function, which is introduce yourself. So this is the introduce yourself function, and this function accepts another argument, which is name. So it accepts the name, and then it passes it here. So we have my name is whatever name we pass into it. Okay, moving on to the last one, which is explain how callbacks are used in asynchronous JavaScript programming. So to be able to explain this, we first need to understand what an asynchronous function is. So an asynchronous function is basically a function that takes time to run, but it doesn't block other codes from running. I think that's like the simple definition of what an asynchronous function is. So it basically accepts, it basically takes time for it to run, and then when it runs and it takes time, then it automatically pass the how will I put it now? It passes the flow to another section of code. So let me give this instance. Let's say we have three functions. We have function 1, 2, and 3. And function 1 takes 1 second, function 2 takes, let's say, 3 seconds, and function 3 takes 1 second as well. Okay, so you notice that function 2 will take time. So instead of function 2 to wait for the whole of the 3 seconds before it runs, then it passes the the flow into the third function. So function 1 will be called first, then it checks function 2. It notices that function 2 is an asynchronous function, so it moves straight to function 3. So after function 3 is called, then it can now go back to function 2 when it is ready. So that is basically what we mean by asynchronous function. So how can we use that in callback? So the example is pretty much simple, but I've created another file here which I'm going to be using. So instead of script now, we can change it to task.js. So you notice what we have here. We have 3 functions, or 2 functions rather. The first function is make requests, and it accepts URL and callback. So remember the callback we are talking about. So it accepts URL and callback. So the URL is now checking the URL. If the length is greater than 0, then it passes 2 things into the callback, which is null and successful. So if the length is greater than 0, it passes null as error. So you notice that this function that we are passing as callback now, it has 2 methods, 2 arguments, which is error and data. So under this section, if the length is greater than 10, then it passes null as error. That means we don't have error, but we have successful as the data. And if otherwise, then it passes error occurred as the error. And then under data, we have null. So if we save this part now and we pass https://appacademy.com, notice that the length of this is more than 10. So if we run this code now and we refresh the page, so we have make request function called, undo callback function called, and then successful. So where is that coming from? So we have make request function called. This is the first one. Then the second one is undo callback function called, and then the third one is going to be what we have here. So it will be either this or this. Okay, so but in this case now it is successful. So that is why we have console log data, and then our data is showing successful. But what if I pass in, let's say I pass in only this, I save, notice that this is less than 10. So if I refresh the page now, it shows that error occurred. So that's basically one of the ways by which we can use a function as, by which we can use a callback in an asynchronous function. So we have other topics and other important aspects by which you can touch, but because of the time limits, I'm going to be stopping here. So thank you very much for your time.